It began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls, one that aides tried to downplay and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Princess Catherine's face as she exited that private meeting said everything the palace couldn't. Something was wrong, and it involved Charlotte. What was first dismissed as a rumor soon turned into a royal firestorm, now confirmed by the very people who fought to protect it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For weeks, whispers had drifted through royal circles, appearing briefly before being shut down almost as quickly as they emerged. Palace aides reportedly refused to answer questions. Longtime staff members, who were normally willing to offer reassurance, suddenly became guarded and cautious. Something had changed, and those closest to the situation seemed determined to keep it hidden from public view. At the center of it all was a private meeting involving Princess Catherine, Prince William, and a carefully selected group of medical advisors. According to royal insiders, the gathering was not part of the usual schedule and was arranged with unusual urgency. No official explanation followed. No public statement was released. Yet the atmosphere surrounding the meeting immediately sparked concern among those familiar with how the palace typically handled sensitive matters. What truly fueled speculation was what happened afterward. Catherine, known for her composure during even the most difficult moments, reportedly emerged from the meeting looking visibly shaken. Those who saw her that day described a woman carrying a burden she could not yet share. Her usual confidence appeared replaced by quiet concern. It was a rare sight, and one that did not go unnoticed. As whispers intensified, reports began circulating about a sudden health development involving Princess Charlotte. Details remained unclear, but the level of secrecy surrounding the matter was unlike anything many royal observers had witnessed in years. Staff members were allegedly instructed to remain silent. Discussions were kept behind closed doors. Even trusted aides were reportedly given only limited information. The mystery deepened later that evening, when William was seen spending private time with Charlotte. To outsiders, it may have appeared to be nothing more than a caring father comforting his daughter. But within royal circles, every action was being examined through a different lens. Why had the palace become so protective? Why was information being withheld so aggressively? And why did those closest to the family appear increasingly concerned? Media insiders who had quietly monitored developments for weeks began speaking more openly. Several claimed that something had felt unusual for some time. Small changes, subtle shifts, and unexpected adjustments behind the scenes had reportedly raised questions long before rumors ever reached the public. Looking back, many now believed those signs had been pointing toward a deeper issue all along. Yet even as speculation continued to grow, another possibility was beginning to emerge. Some insiders suggested the concern surrounding Charlotte was only part of a much larger story. Behind the medical discussions, the protective silence, and the growing tension within palace walls, there appeared to be another secret waiting to surface. A secret connected not simply to the present, but to decisions made years earlier. Decisions involving duty, inheritance, and the future direction of the monarchy itself. As more fragments of information began to come together, it became clear that this developing crisis was about far more than a single troubling report. Hidden beneath the surface was a revelation capable of reopening old wounds and exposing long-buried truths that powerful figures had spent years trying to keep out of public view. But the chilling truth wasn't just about Charlotte's health. It was tied to a royal legacy that had long been buried, until now. For years, Sophie Wessex remained one of the monarchy's most disciplined figures, refusing to engage in public drama. But when one forgotten story resurfaced during a private conversation, even veteran royal insiders were stunned. Because according to whispers spreading through palace corridors, Sophie had just revealed the moment she realized Harry was never truly planning to return. The revelation struck royal observers with unusual force, because Sophie was never known for exaggeration, speculation, or emotional outbursts. Throughout decades of service, she had earned a reputation as one of the family's most trusted confidants, someone who listened more than she spoke, and observed more than she revealed. While others often found themselves at the center of headlines, Sophie remained quietly reliable, building trust through consistency rather than publicity. That reputation is precisely why her alleged recollection carried so much weight. According to insiders, the story emerged during a private discussion among individuals, reflecting on how dramatically the royal family had changed over recent years. What began as a conversation about the present reportedly drifted toward the past, and that was when Sophie brought up an incident many had long forgotten. At first, the memory seemed insignificant. There was no scandal attached to it, no public confrontation, no dramatic declaration, yet those who heard Sophie recount the story reportedly fell silent as the deeper meaning began to settle in. Palace insiders later described the account as deeply telling, not because of what was said, but because of what it revealed about Harry's and state of mind, years before his departure became official. According to those familiar with the discussion, Sophie remembered a moment when conversations about the future of the monarchy were taking place among family members, while others were focused on duty, responsibility, and the long-term stability of the institution. Harry reportedly seemed detached from those concerns. It was not open rebellion. It was something quieter, and perhaps more unsettling, a sense that his heart was already moving in another direction. The more Sophie reflected on that moment, the more significant it appeared. Looking back, she reportedly recognized signs that were almost invisible at the time. Small reactions, subtle comments, a lack of enthusiasm where once there had been commitment. Like many within the family, she had initially assumed these were temporary frustrations. After all, every royal faces periods of doubt and pressure. The weight of expectation can challenge even the strongest individuals. But as years passed and events unfolded, those memories began to take on an entirely different meaning. What once seemed like a passing phase now looked increasingly like the beginning of a much larger transformation. That realization carried a painful implication. If the signs had been there all along, why were they not fully understood? Why did so many continue believing reconciliation was only a matter of time? As Sophie's story quietly spread through royal circles, questions emerged about whether critical warning signs had been overlooked. Some believed the family simply hoped circumstances would improve. Others argued that loyalty and love made it difficult to accept what was unfolding. Nobody wanted to believe that a prince born into the heart of the institution could already be imagining a life beyond it. Yet the more people revisited the timeline, the harder it became to ignore the connections between that forgotten incident and everything that followed. What made the story particularly powerful was that it happened long before public tensions, interviews, memoirs, and headlines transformed private disagreements into global controversy. Long before official departures and public accusations dominated the narrative, there was apparently this quiet moment that Sophie never forgot. A moment that seemed ordinary at the time, but now appeared loaded with meaning. As palace veterans compared memories and reconsidered old conversations, a troubling possibility began to emerge. Perhaps Harry's eventual exit was not the shocking break many believed it to be. Perhaps it was merely the final chapter of a story that had started years earlier, hidden beneath polite smiles and carefully maintained appearances. And the more people revisited that forgotten moment, the more it exposed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. There was no explosive argument, no dramatic walkout, no official announcement. Yet insiders claim one quiet meeting years ago altered the course of royal history forever. What happened inside that room would later be remembered as the first unmistakable sign that Harry's future was moving away from the institution he was born to serve. As Sophie's forgotten story continued circulating through royal circles, attention gradually shifted toward the meeting at the center of it all. At the time, it appeared routine, a private family gathering attended by senior royals, the kind of discussion that happened countless times behind palace walls. There were no headlines afterward, no leaks to the press, no indication that anything historic had occurred. Yet according to those who later reflected on the gathering, the atmosphere carried an uneasiness that only became understandable years later. Looking back, several individuals reportedly realized they had witnessed the earliest chapter of a separation, that would eventually shake the monarchy to its core. What made the memory so striking was not anything Harry openly said. In fact, according to insiders, it was the opposite. During conversations that focused heavily on the future of the institution, the responsibilities of senior royals, and the sacrifices required to protect the crown, Harry reportedly seemed unusually detached. Family members discussed long-term plans. They talked about service, duty, and the growing pressures facing the monarchy. Yet while others participated with focus and concern, Harry allegedly appeared distracted, as though his attention was fixed somewhere else entirely. It was subtle enough to be dismissed at the time, but for someone as observant as Sophie, the change did not go unnoticed. Those who knew Harry best understood that he had always possessed a different spirit from many of his relatives. He could be spontaneous, emotional, and fiercely independent. Those traits had often been viewed as strengths. They made him relatable and human. But according to palace whispers, what Sophie observed during that gathering felt different. It was not rebellion. It was not frustration. It was something deeper, a growing disconnect from the institution itself. Conversations that once would have sparked engagement reportedly received little response. Discussions about future responsibilities seemed unable to capture his interest. While others were thinking about preserving a centuries-old legacy, Harry appeared increasingly removed from the very idea of carrying it forward. As the meeting continued, a quiet tension reportedly settled over the room. Nobody confronted him. Nobody challenged his attitude. Yet several family members allegedly left with a lingering sense of concern they could not fully explain. At the time, they attributed it to stress, personal pressures, or the demands that came with public life. It was easier to believe those explanations than to consider the alternative. After all, the idea that a prince could already be emotionally distancing himself from royal duty seemed almost impossible to imagine. The family had weathered disagreements before. They believed this would pass as well. But history has a way of transforming ordinary moments into defining ones. As years passed and events unfolded, memories of that gathering resurfaced with startling clarity. Every public disagreement, every growing tension, and every step Harry took away from royal life seemed to cast a new light on what had happened in that room. What once appeared insignificant now felt loaded with meaning. The indifference Sophie remembered no longer seemed temporary. The distraction no longer seemed harmless. Instead, they began to resemble warning signs that had been present from the very beginning. For Sophie, that realization reportedly carried a mixture of sadness and certainty. Sadness because it suggested the family's hopes for reconciliation may have been built on a misunderstanding of how far the divide had already grown. Certainty because the pieces finally fit together. The meeting had not revealed Harry's departure outright. It had revealed the first unmistakable indication that his path was already beginning to split from the one expected of him. And as more people revisited that memory, an even more troubling question emerged. If the signs had been visible back then, what other clues had gone unnoticed during the years that followed? What Sophie observed that day would become impossible to ignore, as the months that followed revealed an even deeper divide. At first, the changes seemed subtle. A missed engagement here, a tense conversation there. But behind palace walls, concerns were quietly mounting. Those closest to Harry reportedly noticed a growing distance, not just from royal duties, but from the people who had known him his entire life. In the months following the meeting, Sophie could never forget. The uneasy feeling she carried reportedly began to grow stronger. What had once seemed like a fleeting impression gradually transformed into a troubling pattern. The signs were rarely dramatic on their own. That was what made them so easy to dismiss. A schedule adjustment that appeared insignificant. An obligation postponed without explanation. A conversation cut short before reaching any meaningful conclusion. None of these moments created immediate alarm. Yet when viewed together, they painted a picture that many within the royal household could no longer ignore. Something was changing, and the pace of that change appeared to be accelerating. According to palace whispers, Harry's connection to senior royal responsibilities seemed increasingly strained. Duties that once carried a sense of purpose reportedly began to feel more like obligations he endured rather than embraced. Family members who had spent years working alongside him allegedly noticed a shift in his built enthusiasm. Discussions about future projects, charitable commitments, and long-term royal plans no longer generated the same energy they once had. There was no open rejection of duty. Instead, there appeared to be a growing emotional distance, as though the role itself was beginning to lose its meaning in his eyes. For Sophie, this period was reportedly filled with quiet concern. Unlike others who focused on public appearances, she paid attention to what happened behind closed doors. She noticed changes in tone, changes in attitude, changes that were difficult to explain but impossible to completely overlook. The prince she had known for years seemed increasingly preoccupied by a future that looked very different from the one expected of him. While the institution continued planning decades ahead, Harry reportedly appeared more focused on possibilities beyond the palace gates. That contrast created a tension that slowly spread through family relationships. Reports began emerging of strained interactions with key relatives. Conversations that once flowed naturally reportedly became guarded and uncomfortable. Long-standing bonds faced pressures they had never encountered before. Family gatherings remained outwardly cordial, but beneath the surface, uncertainty continued to grow. Those closest to the situation allegedly sensed that difficult questions were being avoided, rather than answered. Everyone seemed to recognize the tension. Few seemed willing to confront it directly. Even staff members reportedly began noticing unusual changes. Individuals who worked around the family every day were said to have observed shifts in behavior that felt out of character. Small details accumulated over time. Moments of disengagement, unexpected absences, growing frustration with traditions that had once been accepted as part of royal life. None of it provided definitive proof of anything. Yet together, these developments created an atmosphere of unease that became harder and harder to dismiss. At the heart of the growing conflict was a struggle between two powerful forces. On one side stood the expectations of the monarchy, an institution built upon duty, sacrifice, and continuity. On the other stood personal ambition, individual freedom, and the desire to shape a different future. As those competing visions collided, the pressure intensified. Harry reportedly found himself caught between worlds, unable to fully satisfy either one. The more that tension grew, the more visible the cracks became. Yet despite mounting concerns, the palace worked tirelessly to project unity. Publicly, everything appeared stable. Official statements remained positive. Engagements continued. Smiles were offered. Reassurance was carefully maintained. But privately, many insiders allegedly feared that the distance they were witnessing was no longer temporary. It was becoming structural. The divide was widening with every passing month, and those who remembered Sophie's observations from years earlier began to realize they were watching her concerns unfold in real time. What had once seemed like isolated incidents were now connecting into a much larger story, one that was moving steadily toward a conclusion few wanted to imagine. Then came a series of decisions that transformed private concerns into undeniable reality. Every royal story has a turning point, a single moment when uncertainty gives way to clarity. According to palace whispers, Sophie's came during an exchange so revealing that she never forgot it. Years later, that memory would stand as proof that Harry's departure was not a sudden choice, but a path already set in motion. By the time concerns inside the palace had grown impossible to ignore, Sophie reportedly found herself returning again and again to one particular conversation. It was not a confrontation. There were no raised voices, no dramatic declarations, and no immediate sense that history was unfolding. Yet something about that exchange remained lodged in her memory long after it ended. While others moved on, treating it as one of countless discussions that took place within royal life, Sophie allegedly carried a different feeling. She sensed that she had witnessed something important, even if she could not fully explain why at the time. Years later, as events unfolded exactly as she feared, that memory would take on a significance few could have imagined. According to palace insiders, the conversation occurred during a period when questions about the future were becoming increasingly important. Senior family members were discussing responsibilities, upcoming commitments, and the role each individual would play in supporting the monarchy in the years ahead. It was a discussion rooted in duty, continuity, and sacrifice, the very principles that had shaped generations of royal life. Yet somewhere within that exchange, Sophie reportedly noticed a shift, not in what Harry said outright, but in what seemed to matter most to him. His focus appeared to be changing. His priorities seemed to be moving toward a future that no longer aligned comfortably with the expectations surrounding him. For Sophie, that realization was deeply unsettling. Throughout royal history, family members had faced challenges, disagreements, and personal struggles. Those difficulties were not unusual. What felt different this time was the growing sense that Harry's ambitions and the institution's expectations were no longer traveling in the same direction. The commitment that once appeared unquestionable now seemed increasingly uncertain. According to those familiar with the story, Sophie began to suspect that the issue was not temporary frustration or emotional exhaustion. It was something more profound, a gradual redefinition of what Harry wanted from life itself. As months passed, the concerns that began with that single conversation reportedly intensified. Family members who once believed tensions could be resolved started noticing the same troubling signs Sophie had observed. Conversations became more difficult. Expectations became harder to reconcile. The gap between personal goals and royal obligations continued widening. Each new disagreement seemed to reinforce fears that had previously been dismissed. The optimism that everything would eventually return to normal slowly gave way to a more painful possibility that the divide was becoming permanent. What makes the story so powerful today is how accurately it appears to foreshadow everything that followed. The public departures, the interviews, the disputes, the emotional fractures that captured headlines around the world. According to royal insiders, each new development seemed to validate the concerns that had first emerged during that forgotten exchange. What once appeared to be isolated incidents now looked like chapters of the same story. The pieces fit together with unsettling precision, transforming Sophie's private doubts into something far more significant. Over time, the account reportedly became legendary among those who worked within royal circles, not because it involved scandal or controversy, but because it demonstrated how early the warning signs may have appeared. Palace veterans allegedly referenced the story whenever discussions turned to the question of whether Harry's departure could have been prevented. Some believed the outcome became inevitable the moment his priorities began to shift. Others wondered whether different choices might have changed the course of events. But regardless of where opinions differed, one belief became increasingly common. Sophie had recognized the truth long before most people were willing to accept it. And yet, despite the clarity she eventually found, Sophie reportedly kept those conclusions largely to herself. She observed, she listened, she watched events unfold, while the rest of the world continued debating motives and searching for explanations. She already carried a growing certainty about where the story was heading. The tragedy was that few others seemed prepared for what was coming next. The signs were there, hidden in plain sight, but they remained overlooked until circumstances forced everyone to confront them. But while Sophie reached her conclusion privately, the rest of the family was about to face the truth in a far more public way. When the divide finally became visible to the world, the shock was immense. Yet behind closed doors, some senior royals were reportedly less surprised than others. They had seen the warning signs. They had witnessed the growing distance. And they understood that the story Sophie remembered explained far more than anyone realized. For the public, Harry's departure felt sudden, dramatic, and almost unimaginable. One of the most recognizable members of the royal family was stepping away from the institution that had shaped his entire life. Headlines exploded across the world. Commentators debated motives. Supporters and critics rushed to take sides. Every statement was analyzed. Every appearance was dissected. The story dominated conversations far beyond palace walls. To millions watching from afar, it seemed as though a royal chapter had closed overnight. But according to those closest to the family, the reality was far more complicated. The ending may have shocked the world, yet its beginnings had been unfolding quietly for years. Inside the monarchy, reactions reportedly varied dramatically. Some family members were devastated, others were frustrated, a few were said to be quietly resigned. The emotional impact reached every corner of the institution, because this was not simply a public controversy, it was a deeply personal family fracture. Relationships that had survived decades of challenges suddenly found themselves under extraordinary strain. Trust became fragile. Communication became difficult. Long-held assumptions about the future were forced to change. The departure was not just altering Harry's life, it was reshaping the future of the monarchy itself. For William and Catherine, according to Palace Whispers, the situation carried a particularly painful weight. Beyond the headlines and public narratives stood years of shared experiences, family bonds, and expectations for the future. There had once been a vision of unity, a belief that the next generation of royals would navigate the future together. As that vision began to unravel, the emotional cost reportedly became impossible to ignore. What the public often viewed through the lens of royal drama was, for those living through it, a story of disappointment, uncertainty, and loss. The divide was no longer theoretical, it was real, and its consequences touched everyone involved. As events continued unfolding, Sophie's earlier observations reportedly gained remarkable credibility. The concerns she had quietly carried for years suddenly seemed less like speculation and more like foresight. Conversations that once appeared insignificant were revisited with new understanding. Memories that had faded into the background were suddenly viewed as critical clues. Palace insiders allegedly found themselves connecting old moments to recent events, creating a timeline that painted a very different picture from the one many had previously believed. What seemed like a shocking departure now appeared to be the final stage of a process that had begun long before the public ever became aware of it. Meanwhile, the institution itself faced an urgent challenge. The palace had to stabilize not only its public image, but also its internal structure. While global attention remained fixed on the family drama, senior royals reportedly focused on preserving continuity and reassuring the public that the monarchy would endure. Duty remained, responsibilities continued, engagements moved forward. The institution pressed on, determined to project strength during a period of intense scrutiny. Yet beneath those efforts lingered an unavoidable reality. The departure had exposed vulnerabilities that could no longer be ignored. As time passed, a growing number of royal observers began reaching the same conclusion. The outcome, painful as it was, increasingly appeared inevitable. Not because anyone wanted it to happen, but because the signs had been accumulating for years. The growing distance, the shifting priorities, the unresolved tensions, the forgotten conversations. Each piece now seemed to fit into a larger pattern. What once looked like isolated incidents now resembled warning signals pointing toward the same destination. The tragedy was not simply that the divide occurred. It was that so many people hoped it could still be prevented long after the path had already been chosen. And as that realization spread through royal circles, attention gradually shifted away from the departure itself and toward a more unsettling question. If Sophie had recognized the warning signs so early, what exactly had those forgotten moments revealed about Harry's mindset all those years ago? The answer, according to those who revisited the story, would prove even more revealing than the departure itself. As old memories resurfaced, attention turned toward what those forgotten moments truly revealed about Harry's intentions. Sometimes, the biggest clues are hidden in plain sight. The story Sophie reportedly shared was not dramatic, scandalous, or explosive at the time. In fact, many barely noticed it. Yet years later, it would be viewed as the missing piece of a puzzle that had puzzled royal watchers around the world. What made the story so remarkable was its simplicity. There were no shocking revelations attached to it when it first occurred. No headlines were written. No palace alarms were raised. No commentators rushed to analyze its significance. It was merely another moment among thousands that unfold within royal life every year. The monarchy was dealing with larger issues, bigger responsibilities, and more immediate concerns. Attention was focused elsewhere, family members were navigating public duties. Advisors were managing institutional challenges. The future seemed stable enough that few people felt compelled to examine a brief conversation or a subtle shift in attitude. At the time, it simply did not appear important. Yet history often works in unexpected ways. Events that seem insignificant in the moment can later become impossible to ignore. As Harry's relationship with the monarchy continued evolving, old memories began resurfacing with startling clarity. The further the story progressed, the more people found themselves looking backward rather than forward. Suddenly, moments that had once appeared ordinary were being re-evaluated through an entirely different lens. What had been dismissed as harmless became meaningful. What had been overlooked became central. And what had been forgotten became impossible to forget. According to palace insiders, this shift in perspective happened gradually. At first, only a handful of people connected Sophie's recollection to the larger narrative. But as years passed and public events unfolded, the parallels became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Every new development seemed to cast a fresh light on that forgotten moment. The growing distance from royal responsibilities, the tensions surrounding family relationships, the decisions that ultimately reshaped the monarchy's future. Each piece appeared to lead back to the same question. Had the signs been visible all along? Royal commentators reportedly began revisiting the timeline with renewed interest. Conversations that once centered on the departure itself gradually shifted toward the years leading up to it. Analysts, observers, and long-time royal watchers started searching for the earliest indicators that something fundamental had changed. In doing so, many found themselves returning to the story Sophie had shared. What made it so compelling was not that it provided all the answers, it was that it offered context. It helped explain why certain developments unfolded the way they did. It suggested that the departure was not the beginning of the story, but rather the conclusion of a process that had been unfolding quietly for years. As this perspective gained traction, Sophie's role within the narrative reportedly became increasingly important. She was not viewed as someone predicting the future. Instead, she was seen as someone who had paid close attention when others were focused elsewhere. Her observations carried weight because they emerged from patience rather than speculation. She had noticed subtle changes before they became obvious. She had recognized patterns before they became impossible to deny. And as more people revisited her recollections, they began to appreciate just how much those small details revealed. The effect on the broader narrative was significant. The conversation surrounding Harry's departure slowly began to evolve. Instead of asking only why it happened, people started asking when it truly began. That distinction changed everything. The focus shifted away from a single decision and toward a series of moments that gradually led to the same outcome. The departure no longer appeared as a sudden break from royal life. It looked increasingly like the final step in a journey that had started years earlier, hidden beneath routine appearances and carefully maintained public unity. The deeper people looked, the more connections they uncovered. Each memory seemed to reinforce another. Each forgotten detail appeared to support a larger pattern. And with every new revelation, the mystery surrounding Harry's intentions became a little clearer. The story Sophie remembered was no longer just an interesting anecdote from the past. It had become a key to understanding everything that followed. And when all the pieces were finally placed together, the picture that emerged was impossible to ignore. The monarchy has survived wars, scandals, abdications, and crises. But some of its most defining moments begin with a single observation that only one person truly understands. According to royal whispers, Sophie's story was exactly that, a quiet realization that years later became one of the most revealing truths of all. As the years passed, and the dust surrounding Harry's departure slowly settled, the significance of Sophie's recollection only continued to grow. What began as a private memory shared among a small circle of trusted individuals evolved into one of the most discussed narratives within royal circles. Not because it contained scandalous secrets or dramatic confrontations, but because it offered something far more powerful: understanding. In a story filled with public statements, competing interpretations, and endless speculation, Sophie's perspective seemed to provide a rare glimpse into the deeper currents that had been shaping events long before anyone realized where they were leading. Her story did not explain every decision, nor did it answer every question. Yet it revealed something essential. It suggested that the path Harry ultimately followed may have begun taking shape years before the world ever noticed. For many royal observers, that realization transformed the entire narrative. The focus shifted away from sudden events and toward long-term intentions. The clues were no longer viewed as isolated moments. They became part of a larger pattern: the private conversations, the growing distance from duty, the subtle changes in attitude, the increasing tension between personal ambitions and royal expectations. Each detail, when examined alone, seemed insignificant. Together, they painted a remarkably consistent picture, a picture that pointed toward a future Harry may have already been imagining, while others still believed he would remain firmly within the institution. At the heart of the story lies a question that has echoed throughout royal history. What happens when personal desires collide with inherited responsibility? For generations, members of the monarchy have faced the difficult balance between individual freedom and collective duty. Some embraced that burden, others struggled beneath its weight. According to those who reflect on Sophie's observations, Harry's story may ultimately be remembered as one of those defining conflicts. A story not simply about departure, but about identity, purpose, and the challenge of reconciling personal happiness with public obligation. For William and Catherine, the consequences of that conflict reportedly carried profound significance. As the monarchy adjusted to a changing reality, they increasingly found themselves at the center of its future. The responsibilities once expected to be shared among a broader group now rested more heavily on their shoulders. Through uncertainty and public scrutiny, they continued moving forward, representing stability during a period marked by division. Their journey became intertwined with the institution's effort to adapt, evolve, and maintain continuity despite the challenges it faced. And adapt it did. The monarchy has always survived by adjusting to changing circumstances while preserving its core identity. New realities emerged, expectations shifted, relationships changed, yet the institution endured. What once seemed like an unimaginable disruption gradually became part of a new chapter. The shock gave way to acceptance. The uncertainty gave way to direction. And as the years moved forward, the story that once dominated headlines became part of a much larger legacy. Perhaps that is why Sophie's forgotten observation continues to resonate. It reminds people that history is rarely shaped by a single dramatic moment. More often, it is shaped by quiet realizations, subtle warnings, and truths that reveal themselves slowly over time, long before the public debates, long before the official announcements, and long before the world reached its conclusions. One person reportedly recognized that something fundamental had changed. The significance of that realization would not become clear immediately, but eventually, the evidence surrounding it became impossible to ignore. Because in the end, the most powerful royal revelations are not the ones announced from palace balconies, but the ones quietly recognized years before the world finally catches up. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.